women can just bring so much in terms of economic growth, in terms of profit to companies, in terms of common sense in risk-taking policies.
In Canada, like all over the world, much of the economic and labor force growth we've experienced over the last many decades is because of women entering into and changing the workforce.
In 1976, 92% of women said sexual harassment was a problem. Now it's 99%.
This is not just a Hollywood problem. This is a problem that runs across industry around the world.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Katie Couric, and as someone who's obsessed with The Handmaid's Tale, I just want to say I'm really happy I made it to Canada. So I'm happy to be here, happy to see all of you, and my two guests need no introduction, partially because Tina already did it, but I'm so pleased to be joined by self-described feminist, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and an extraordinary role model, Madam Christine Lagarde, who since 2011 has been Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. So welcome to both of you. And before we get to specifically to gender issues and the extraordinary work that I think you have both done on this topic, Prime Minister Trudeau, I just wanted to ask you, what's the latest with Nafta? We got to make a little news here, people.
Sorry to disappoint, but we continue to work hard and be positively optimistic that we can get to a win-win-win for all three countries. You know, we are working hard, and we know that it's possible to get to it. We just have to keep working at it. The relationship between Canada, the US, and Mexico has created extraordinary economic growth over the past 2.5 decades. There's an opportunity to update NAFTA, and we're happy to be doing it. But as I've said, it has to be the right deal. It has to be a good deal.
Getting there has not been half the fun.
Well, you know what? I am lucky in this that I have an extraordinary woman leading up that charge, in Chrystia Freeland, who is absolutely amazing. She'll be here later today. You guys can give her all the props that she rightly deserves. We are incredibly lucky to have her around the table.
In fact, Madam Lagarde, I know as a former trade minister, you have a lot of respect and appreciation for what she's going through right now.
I have enormous respect and friendship for Chrystia, and I think that she's under huge pressure from all corners, and luckily she has the support of her Prime Minister and all women around the world who want her to succeed in her negotiations. She certainly has mine, big way.
All right, great. So let's get started on sort of the big topic that we're tackling today. I know that earlier this year, Prime Minister, Canada hosted the G7 summit, and you put women's advancement quite high on the agenda. Your Women's Advisory Council published a report called Make Gender Inequality History. With so many crises happening worldwide, why was this so important to you? Why make it such a high priority?
Well, the G7 is fundamentally an economic forum. It's a gathering of 7 of the most advanced economies in the world to talk about sort of the big issues and the big trends and the big challenges facing our economies, our workforces. And there is no question that increasing growth, increasing opportunity for everyone is not just a moral argument, it's a fundamental economic argument. So every G7, the president country gets to set a couple of themes that are particularly important to dive into. And for example, we did one on oceans that is talking about oceans cleanup and oceans protection and showing global leadership as a council, which is great. But instead of doing that also with women, where there would be a session on women's empowerment or advancement, we said, no, we're making it a horizontal theme. So we put together a women's advisory council, a gender advisory council, of which Christine was a special advisor, an important player on, to make sure that every single session, every single focus, ministerial meeting or agreement that came through the G7 had representatives of this Women's Council involved, engaged, to recognize that women's issues aren't just their own little silo. They touch on every single aspect of any economic conversation. And that horizontal approach is one that we're really delighted we were able to launch, have a significant outcomes to, and will continue next year with France's G7 leadership as well.
And Madame Lagarde, I know you've been focused on these issues for a long time. Certainly we've been hearing about these issues for a long time. I know with the Me Too movement, we're going to talk about that a little later in our conversation, they have greater urgency. But what other factors do you think are at work that are really propelling these issues front and center? What is going on? Why does it feel like kismet for at least the conversation, if not the action?
Well, first of all, let me tell you from my perspective, because I was sitting in all these G7 finance ministers, leaders meetings. And what Canada has done under the leadership of Prime Minister Trudeau is something that I would not have anticipated. You've made women discrimination, the whole issue of women, a topic that is an absolute must. And I think that you, for many of those countries that were involved, made it politically incorrect to actually be dismissive, be discriminatory, or be full of, you know, those very funny smiles that you get sometimes, you know? Oh, a woman issue, yes, of course. Well, that's no longer in the cards. And I have to tell you, huh?
Patronizing?
It's a combination of patronizing, vaguely amused, entertained. That is all gone. And, you know, it was...
Not all gone, well, but it's...
No, I'm talking about the G7 circle. I don't think that any other G7 leaders will dare say, no, I'm sorry, but I'm not putting this on the agenda. It's ancillary. You know, the way you put it up there, you insisted with your colleagues. We all women of the W7, because there was an advisory council that was composed of many talented women, including many Canadian women. The way we sort of looked at all these leaders in the eyes, it made it just impossible for them to either ignore or consider as secondary that particular topic. So it's both the horizontality and the height at which Canada put women that really made a huge difference in my view.
So we're talking about leadership.
We're talking about leadership, we're talking about the proper measurement of what it means, because as the Prime Minister said, it's an economic summit. And all those leaders are interested in solid, sustainable, inclusive growth. And if you say growth, it has to go through women. If you say inclusive, it has to go through women. If you say sustainable, it has to go through women. Because, you know, I'm not inventing, and I'm not, you know, talking about the moral side of it, but just at the IMF, we've done a lot of analysis of what it means. It improves growth, it improves inclusiveness, and it certainly improves diversification of the economy, which means more sustainable economies. And that ignores the whole climate change approach, which is also very often, how would I put it? Better, I think women tend to be more attentive to those issues than men in general. So, voila.
So it's good for, I concur with you, with present company excluded, but you know, clearly it's good for the bottom line, and yet 90% of countries still have at least one legal barrier to women's economic participation. These barriers impact 2.7 million women globally, include things like restricting their access to credit, denying them their ability to own property. So what will it take to remove those barriers?
I think I think for a lot of time we do phrase it as sort of a moral or a human rights or an equality or a enlightened perspective that yes, you should liberate women, you should empower them, you should celebrate and support them as the right thing to do. And there's a lot of people who get that, for whom that is enough of an argument. But for when you look at the entrenched status quo, the way the power systems have evolved over the past decades and centuries, you realize that it actually takes a stronger, grounded argument in economic facts. And I think the example of Rwanda, for example, where after the genocide 20 years ago, there were so many more women in the workforce or needing to get into the workforce than men, that their economy and their opportunities have increased. We know that, and we shouldn't take a terrible tragedy to awaken ourselves, but there are studies after study, and Christine knows and has talked about a lot of them, that show that organizations with better gender balance, better diversity, make better decisions, not just more profits, but better, far-reaching, beneficial outcomes. Making an economic argument about better equality of opportunity is something that is harder and harder to stand against anywhere in the world.
But 90%, I mean, we've heard these economic arguments, honestly, with all due respect, for years, and yet it hasn't moved these countries to eliminate these barriers. So how can you do it? How can you force the issue?
First of all, Canada is not in the 90%. I checked before I came in.
Okay.
So at least your constitution, your rules, your principles do not embed any discrimination, which doesn't mean to say that you have total equality in terms of female labor force participation, in terms of gender gap. You still have issues, and Canada does. But for those 90 other countries, there has to be a sense of political determination, of leadership, of political correctness about fixing those issues. And it works. That's the other thing which we have demonstrated through our study. Because when you fix those discrimination, when you, for instance, you give access to finance, when you allow proper inheritance equally between genders, it changes the map. And there are various countries that have done it in the sub-Saharan African continent, in Latin America. Wherever the changes have taken place, there has been, as a result, within the next 5 years, a significant change in female labor force participation, in gender gap, and in women entrepreneurship. So it does work, and it does improve the bottom line, not just of corporations, but of countries as well. So we just need to rehash all the time and repeat and make the case as often and as loudly as we can. And I think that there are now, enough, there's never enough, but there are many of us who are very concerned that these things actually change, and our voice carries. And Tina is one of those who, year after year, is pushing those issues.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister, since the early 50s, Canadian women's participation in the workplace has grown to over 80%, but in the last decade, it's plateaued, and it still trails men by 9%. Why the plateau, and what needs to happen to restart this forward momentum and get Canadian women working in equal numbers?
And it's not just workforce participation, it's money earned on the dollar. You'd be surprised how low Canada is actually on pay equity, which is frustrating because we have different jurisdictions that brought in pay equity legislation a decade or more ago. We've just realized we have a lot more to do. A piece of it is sort of symbolic, is demonstrating that the cabinet can be half men, half women at the highest levels. It's about demonstrating that makes a better level of decision making. But more than that, and encouraging businesses to do that. But we do need concrete pay equity legislation. We do need transparency legislation as well, and we're moving forward on those kinds of things that will, eventually move the markers in a significant way, because when women are not succeeding to the same level as men, our society is poorer. Over the past 40 years, over my lifetime, women entering the workforce have added a third to Canada's GDP. We're looking for where the next growth is coming from. That's an obvious place where proper empowerment of women entrepreneurs, of women in the workforce, is essential to create the kinds of growth and benefits that we need in our society.
You know, for what it's worth, there is one other area that maybe Canada wants to look into, because based on research that will be published shortly, women are more affected and will be more affected by artificial intelligence, biotech innovations, and automatization on the in the workplace. And it's quite fascinating to see that about 11% of women's job will be either completely removed or significantly affected, as opposed to 9% of men's job. So women are at a disadvantage. The numbers are a little bit higher for Canada, and I was really surprised by that. It also has to do with the fact that in the service industry, there are many tasks that are repetitive, that will be automated, and where Canadian women have their jobs, and that's where they will be hurt eventually. So I think anticipating that and, you know, putting in place the policies, helping people to adjust, making sure that they have the right skill sets in order to not resist, but adjust to those changes that will take place, I think will be fantastic.
That's really important for everyone, men and women, right?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things. The fact that we have invested massively in AI and we see Canada has leadership around that means nothing if we're not equipping our workforce, our citizens, to be able to handle that transition that is coming everywhere around the world. And that's why on getting women into STEM, we've had significant investments. There is now a lot of pressure on universities to make sure that the research chairs are more gender balanced. But it also means investing to get women entrepreneurs, more women entrepreneurs, investing to get more women in the trades as well, in terms of Red Seal trades. There's a lot of things that we have to do to prepare for the transition into the new work, and making sure from the get-go that we're looking at reducing barriers to women is essential, even if it weren't the fact that there is an inequality in the disruption potentially.
Let's talk about the elusive work-life balance, because Madame Lagarde, I mean, you've obviously been able to juggle motherhood and a very demanding career.
I've been able to juggle fatherhood.
I was going to ask you, don't worry. That you just, I was going to ask you.
Sorry, I think you were probably going there, and I cut off the gag. But
actually, my next question was, Mr. Prime Minister, what about you? I think part of the problem is women are always asked that question. Men rarely are. Just so you don't think that I was being sexist against the Prime Minister. But you know, what have you learned along the way that you feel could help other women in terms of, and fathers, mothers and fathers, in providing more support, more recognition for unpaid work, paternity leave, all kinds of things that you think would then kind of be the wind beneath their wings as they try to have a more active professional life?
It takes a whole society. It's not just upon the policymakers, it's also upon the corporate world, it's upon society as a whole. I was lucky because, you know, when my two boys were born, I was a young associate in a law firm, but luckily I started my legal career in France. And France has these childcare centers and childcare facilities that are accessible, that they're not plenty. There is shortage, there could be more, but it was, you know, sufficiently available so that if you could plan your motherhood 2 years ahead, and register the kid to be born, then you would have access to a childcare center. But I was also lucky because I took that fight within Baker McKenzie, and I managed to get the partnership to agree that it's not because a young female partner goes on maternity leave, so to speak, for a month or 2 months, that she loses the benefit of her participation. So we put in place a system that equalized the participation, which is the compensation that partners were receiving, and the male partners, because it was, you know, vastly male dominated in those days, agreed that they would, you know, chip in and pay for that. So what I mean is, it's policies, childcare centers, special benefits made available for women who have a child, and I know that Canada is ahead of that in that game. But also in the corporate world, there has to be a recognition that women, for a portion of their life, are going to, at least for the moment, that we are the ones pregnant, we are the ones breastfeeding, we are the ones having those duties, and no matter how you know, supportive a partner is going to be, we still conduct those activities. And the corporate world has to appreciate, recognize, and you have this thing which is back to Bay Street business. Back to Bay Street. Does that mean something to any of you? Return to Bay Street. Return to Bay Street. For the financial sector, I think that's good. And many companies and corporates should acknowledge that and make sure that once a woman has contributed to a company, if she goes away for a period of her life, it should be made easier for her to come back, and there should be programs in place to accommodate and help her adjust to that world which she has left for a little while. And there's no reason why, as I did it for my first child, you go away for 2 weeks, you feel guilty for the rest of the next few months, and not the rest of your life, I have to say. When they grow up, they recognize.
I was so excited to go back to work after I had children, and I don't feel bad about it because they're great girls. Anyway, Prime Minister, what about the use it or lose it paternity leave, and really trying to make sure that fathers, while they can't breastfeed, at least not yet, that they take an active role in child rearing?
Well, I think understanding that there's a new generation of fathers who are wanting to be more engaged, and I think helping that along. Because if you imagine, we are bringing in next year, use it or lose it, 5 weeks of second parent leave, which of course will be mostly used by fathers, hopefully. Where if you imagine an employer hiring a 25-year-old. He's got to know that, or she's got to know that whether it's a man or a woman they're hiring, if they're going to start a family, there's a chance that they take time off. And that sort of evens things a little bit. More than that, it also gives men an opportunity to experience what I was just in a great roundtable with women entrepreneurs, being the primary caregiver for a few weeks. Understanding that it's you that has to change your plans because there was a bleeding nose at daycare or in grade 2. It's you who has to just sort of suddenly be the one stop for everything. I mean, I know I'm guilty of this. When I'm in charge, something goes wrong, I usually just have to wait till Sophie shows up and she helps me with the rest of the parenting stuff. And I'm a pretty good dad, but there is that idea of giving the responsibility to men in a very explicit way leads to the kinds of societal shifts that we need, where so much of the unpaid work, so much of the extra family tasks automatically fall on women, and they shouldn't. There should be much more shared equal parenting, and these steps are the kinds of things that, yes, government can do. And you're right, it's businesses, it's the whole of society, but we all have to figure out paths to be part of that, and that's why I'm glad we're doing that.
Gosh, I can't believe how fast the time has gone, because we don't have that much time left, which is super annoying, because I could talk to you all for another hour. But Madame Lagarde, let's talk about not just participation, but leadership roles. You obviously have had a number of extraordinary leadership roles throughout your career. It's still frustrating that more women are not given the top jobs in these companies and these corporations. What can be done to change that?
You know, I used to think that there should not be quotas, but I have massively changed my mind on that. And I think that if we do not have in place distributed quotas, I'll go one step further than what I used to say. It has to be distributed along the hierarchy of a company, because it's all very well saying there has to be parity. Yes, there will always be parity, but if you start distinguishing between the supervisory positions, the leadership positions, the management position, and then the sort of overall size of a company, it's a whole big difference between the top numbers, which are generally low, the bottom number that are very generally high, and the overall, which is pretty much average and makes everybody proud. Well, there has to be distributed quota, and if we want to make sure that there is the pipeline from which women will be selected and will prove themselves according to all the normal, regular rules. But if that pipeline is not in place, it's never going to happen. And for the pipeline to be there, we need to have those distributed quotas throughout the organizations.
And in fact, Prime Minister, less than 10% of Canada's senior corporate jobs are held by women. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, I mean, one of the things I talk about just in terms of the pipeline, and we were worried about that pipeline. That's why before it could be 2015 and we have a gender-balanced cabinet, I had to go out and we recruited in 2014, 2013, 2012, and got women to step up into politics. Now the challenge is around retention, because politics is still a very difficult game, and it's not necessarily... there's still huge barriers and old boys approach in many ways that cause real challenges, and therefore how we're changing the culture within the political world we're in, including things like Me Too and sexual harassment, become really, really important around making sure that women make it from that entry level to the top level positions, and more of them. So it's not just the entry pipeline, as you've said, it's maintaining a progression throughout all levels of business and of politics. And that's something that requires constant engagement and mostly constant listening, open, safe conversations about the real challenges and the real barriers are really hard to have in a corporate or political session context, but they're so important.
And in closing, Madam Lagarde, I mean, how do you see the Me Too, Time's Up movements, which really have become global phenomenons? How do you see them changing the conversation and pushing these issues forward? Because as we saw in the video, and as I know you know, sexual harassment is a real problem in terms of keeping women in the workforce and even attracting them to some sectors of the workforce.
Well, they are more than welcome movements, and movements that, as you said, have spread in many advanced economies. I wouldn't think that, you know, all emerging and low-income countries have yet been contaminated properly, and they should be.
I like that phrase, contaminated properly.
Yeah, I think that it's critically important. And then there has to be that ownership by man and woman, both, that this simply cannot happen. And that it has to be talked about, it has to be raised at the highest level at all tables, and not just, you know, in the kitchen or in the backyard.
And having women in leadership positions is a very effective antidote.
Absolutely, yeah, that is, I mean, it certainly inhibits many of those who would otherwise not talk about it, fear of retaliation. So I think pushing the women at all levels of society, politics, private sector is critically important. And these women, once they're there, they have to carry the flag, and they have to protect, cover, enhance, and be the spokesperson as well, which they don't always do.
All right, on that bummer of a note, Madam Christine Lagarde, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie.